Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming, as you do year after year after year, at least many of you do, for supporting these lectures every year. This year, as I think most of you know, the topic for our lectures for this year is violence. Is it truly inevitable? Are the humans, among humans anyway, and we have 5 speakers who are here to address that topic from 5, I think, quite different points of view, and that's the point of the lecture series. So, again, thank you very much for coming. My name is John Horgan, and I am the director of the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice here at St. Scholastica. This lecture and this lecture series is sponsored by the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice here at the college. And we're grateful, very grateful, I am in particular, for the support and the continued support of the Alworth family for these lectures. Yeah, go ahead, give them and these lectures are also supported by the Warner Lecture Series of the Manitou Fund, the DeWitt and Carolyn Van Ivre Foundation, and by Mary C. Van Ivre in memory of William Van Ivre, a former trustee of the college. Additional support has been received from the Global Awareness Fund of the Duluth Superior Area Community Foundation, Reader Weekly newspaper of Duluth, and from numerous other private donors. I thank you all very much for your continued support. Those of you who are new or haven't been a part of this too much over the years are welcome to get on our mailing list. There's a sign-up sheet in the foyer out there and a table right in that corner, and you can do that. Speaking of things to sign up for or tables out there, there's also a table out there sponsored by the Duluth Sister Cities International Organization, and they're selling tickets to a concert in this auditorium that will be held on the 23rd, that's a Friday, of October, also sponsored in part by the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice. The concert is to support the good and important work that the Duluth Sister Cities International organization in town supports, peacemaking work at the grassroots level. So they are selling something. They're selling tickets to the concert. Also, there's another table there by an organization called Veterans for Peace. I don't believe there'll be any requirement that you exchange money for what they're selling, but what they are selling is peace also. And so I invite you to visit both of those tables. And by the way, I'm a member of both of those organizations, I think full disclosure here. After these lectures, after every lecture, we invite you to come back and chat about what you heard. We call those talkbacks. The talkback session for this lecture is going to be held in a week, and it will be conducted by Professor Haji Dakanshi. He's his biography is here. You should have had this flyer. And he's a professor of political science with a special focus on peace studies. I thought he would be an ideal person. Even though he's not here tonight, he will see the lecture and help us all talk about it when it's over. One last thing of housekeeping, and that is that when the lecture is completed, we, of course, will invite you all to ask questions, and we'll have a Q&A session as well. And we use these 2 microphones, and I'll ask the speaker to just recognize people in turn to ask questions. Keep your questions brief and to the point. And the other rule, students go first. Okay? And after the students have asked all the really good questions that they always have, then we invite you to ask questions as well, time permitting, of course. Okay, that's it. Our speaker this evening is a science journalist and director of the Center for Science Writings at Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey, where he also teaches science journalism, the history of science, and other courses. A former science writer at Scientific American, our speaker also has written for the New York Times, the National Geographic, Time, Newsweek, the Washington Post, Slate, and numerous other publications throughout the world. He currently writes for the Crosscheck blog for Scientific American, and he contributes to Science Faction on bloggingheads.tv. John Horgan's first book, The End of Science, came out in 1996 with considerable acclaim as well as controversy. And by the way, that book was republished this year with a new preface which reflects no change of heart about the future of science. Mr. Horgan followed The End of Science with The Undiscovered Mind, which critiques neuroscience, psychoanalysis, psychopharmacology, evolutionary psychology, behavioral genetics, artificial intelligence, and other mind-related fields, all in one book. Other books that he has written include Rational Mysticism, which deals with the interface of science, religion, and mysticism. His most recent book, The End of War, of course, is the basis for this evening's talk. Mr. Horgan's awards include a Templeton-Cambridge Journalism Fellowship in Science and Religion, the American Psychiatric Association Certificate of Commendation for Outstanding Reporting on Psychiatric Issues, 2 Science Journalism Awards from the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the National Association of Science Writers Science in Society Award. Mr. Horgan was an associate editor at IEE Spectrum, the Journal of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, from 1983 to 1986. He received his bachelor's degree in English and a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University. He lives in Hoboken, New Jersey, has 2 adult children, Mac 22 and Sky 20. When he's not thinking and writing about science, Mr. Horgan enjoys playing ice hockey. And yes, he's one more thing. He has just written a science fiction novel about a science writer who undergoes a genetic mutation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. John Horgan.
I'm a nonviolent hockey player, most of the time. So it's really a pleasure to be here. I've never been to Duluth before, and I already love it. And I'm getting a wonderful vibe from this school and from the community here. So I'm very happy to be here. And thanks for that wonderful introduction, Tom. So I want to start by asking you a question. Let's see. That I've been asking quite a bit for more than 10 years. And actually, I'm really curious to know what this particular group of people will say in response to this question. So, how many of you think that permanent world peace is possible? I don't mean just no active wars. I mean that war isn't even conceivable. No war, not even the threat of war between nations. How many of you think that that kind of world is attainable for us? Show of hands. Okay. How many of you think that that world is not attainable? All right, you are kind of like everybody else, actually. Frankly, I'm a little disappointed. So I've been, the first time I asked this was a couple of weeks after the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. An Episcopal priest in my hometown asked me to give a talk about scientific theories of war to his parish, and I tried to be upbeat, even though I was covering some very grim material, and at the very end, everybody looked kind of depressed, and I said, but, you know, we can end war someday, And everybody was looking very skeptical then. And so then I asked for a show of hands. And this was a community of good, green, liberal, Democrat, peace-loving people. And virtually everybody thought that peace was impossible. And I thought that might be an anomaly. But it's not. So I've been asking this question so I've been teaching for 10 years. Every one of my classes, I ask my students this question, and then I often, in fact, I just did this a couple of weeks ago, I asked my students to poll, let's say, 10 other students, and to come in with the results. I've conducted this poll on the internet, in Europe, across the United States, and the vast majority of people think that war is a permanent part of the human condition. And it cuts across political lines, male, female, young, old. It's pretty much a universal pessimism. And often, when I ask people why they say that, they say something like, war is part of human nature. War is in our genes. It's just the way we are. This is what I call the Darwinian theory of war. Because it suggests that war is something that evolved in us through our evolutionary history and even prehistories. War is ancient and innate. That's what the theory says. And according to many people, if it's ancient and innate, it's also inevitable. And this is historically a very common view. So here are a couple of famous people who have been what I call war fatalists. One is Santayana, the philosopher who shortly after World War I, which was supposed to be the war that ends all war, he overheard a couple of veterans saying, well, that was horrible, but at least it'll never happen again. And then he wrote an essay about that and said, only the dead have seen the end of war. By the way, this is often attributed to Plato. You might have heard it attributed to him before, but that's incorrect. One of the places that attributes this quote to Plato incorrectly is the West Point War Museum, which is right across the Hudson River from where I used to live. You see that inscribed above the entrance to the museum, which is this bizarre celebration of the history of weaponry, starting from a stone axe all the way to a replica of one of the bombs dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. Here's another fatalistic quote. Barack Obama, in his Nobel acceptance speech in 2009, said, war in one form or another appeared with the first man. That's, by the way, that's a factual claim. We will not eradicate violent conflict in our lifetime. So that's an expression of what I would call, he's alluding to the Darwinian theory of war there. What worries me is that this kind of fatalism, especially when it's expressed by the most powerful person in the world, can be self-fulfilling. If you think that the world is and always will be an intrinsically dangerous place filled with people who may do you harm, that's going to affect your foreign policy and your military policies. You're going to want to make sure that you win any war when it inevitably breaks out. So this is why I wrote The End of War, to try to counter this belief. So the first thing I want to do in this talk is look at some of the evidence for the Darwinian theory of war. And there are two main strands. One comes from studies of tribal societies who are supposed to be representative of our ancestors before civilization, when we were hunter-gatherers primarily, all right? And there are various tribes around the world that have been isolated from civilization and are thought to be displaying this kind of Paleolithic or at least Neolithic behavior. A really famous one is the Yanomamo, a tribe in the Amazon region of South America. They were discovered or first intensely studied by an anthropologist named Napoleon Chagnon in the 1960s, and he wrote what is still, I think, the best-selling work of anthropology of all time about the Yanomamo, and I think it became a huge hit because it was filled with sex and violence. So the Yanomamo are almost comically violent. By the way, I'm just curious, how many of you have heard of the Yanomamo? So maybe, I assume that they're still taught in courses on anthropology and human history. These guys, just for fun, you'd have two men face off against each other with enormous clubs and bash each other over the head until one was knocked unconscious. They would show off their fractured skulls like badges of honor. They also, men in one village would band together and raid another village and stab a few people and then run back, sometimes kidnap females. Chagnon described all this, and it was a sensation. It came out during the Vietnam War. A lot of people thought this was evidence of our warlike nature. And there have been some other tribes that have still exhibit this kind of behavior. This is thought to be support for the Darwinian theory of war. Another piece of evidence that emerged in the 1970s and has been compiled ever since then has to do with chimpanzees, our closest genetic relatives. So scientists at Jane Goodall's reservation in Africa first saw chimps in one group banding together, roaming the perimeter of their territory. They find a chimp from another community and they beat it to death. The Darwinian theorists say this cannot be a coincidence, that our closest relatives also engage in something like war. So this has led to a flood of books propagating the Darwinian theory of war. A really influential one was written by a Harvard psychologist named Richard Wrangham. He wrote a book called Demonic Males, came out almost 20 years ago now. And he has this line in it that expressed its basic theme. Humans are the dazed survivors of a 5 million year habit of lethal aggression. Wrangham builds the case that the roots of war go all the way back to way before the origin of our species, Homo sapiens, to the common ancestor that we share with chimpanzees millions of years ago. This book was very popular in the White House in the Clinton administration. Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton were both reportedly fans of this book. I threw in this final line after I learned that one of the speakers in this series is Adrian Raine, who has done a lot of research on the biology of violence and aggression. I see the Darwinian theory of war as very much of a piece with this new fondness for biological theories of human behavior, genetic, evolutionary, chemicals in your brain. I've been writing about science for more than 30 years. I have never seen science become more, I call it, biodeterministic than it is right now. And it's not reflecting the quality of the science. I think this is a cultural phenomenon. We're really fascinated by these kinds of theories that seem to take our own agency away from us. Here's just a sampling of some of the books that have propagated the Darwinian theory of war lately. You can get a feel for it, for the kind of writing just from the titles. Demonic Males, Sex and War, which is actually a great book in spite of its lurid title. And Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature, which is actually a marvelous book. Maybe we can talk about that more later. But it propagates the Darwinian theory of war. Steven Pinker, who also is at Harvard, is a true believer. By the way, Harvard has some of the most prominent advocates of the Darwinian theory of war are at Harvard for some reason. I call them the Harvard Hawks, even though politically they aren't hawkish, but their scientific views of war tend to be very deterministic. So counter-evidence. There is no evidence that war goes back millions of years, or even hundreds of thousands of years, or tens of thousands of years. The oldest clear-cut sign, evidence, of mass violence is a mass grave discovered near the Nile River in modern-day Sudan back in the 1960s. So you have skeletons that the skulls have holes in them. There are projectile points embedded in the skeletons. It's clear-cut signs of violence against these individuals. But that grave is an outlier. The really good evidence for war emerges much later in various regions around the world. The first really good evidence of war is found in Mesopotamia, in modern-day Iraq, about 10,000 years ago. And the evidence, again, consists of skeletons showing marks of violence. You've got art, depictions of battles and so forth. You've got weapons that are clearly designed not for hunting, but for humans killing other humans, fortifications, and so forth. Now, a common response to this is that, well, there wasn't evidence of humans doing much of anything before 10,000 years ago, and that's absolutely not the case. We have very good evidence of other cultural innovations, including stone tools, hunting, art, music, going back hundreds of thousands of years ago. And also, it's important to know that there are some settlements, very early settlements, in all these major regions where the first civilizations began, that show no signs of war for long periods, centuries, in some cases even thousands of years, and then war emerges quite clearly in the archaeological record. So the evidence for the Darwinian theory of war, I welcome pushback on this because it's a very important point. So if you want to go into it further in the Q&A, please let's do that. But I'm astonished that it's become so popular, considering how appallingly flimsy the evidence is. Again, I see that as a cultural phenomenon. So the next theory I want to look at, also very popular, often combined with the Darwinian theory, I call the Malthusian theory, reference to the gloomy British scholar cleric who a couple of hundred years ago said that all populations inevitably go through a boom-bust cycle. They produce more offspring than can be sustained by the environment. They have famine, disease, or violence to cull the population. And so the basic idea is that you have too many people. Resources are scarce. Humans compete for resources. It might have been game, watering holes thousands of years ago. More recently, it would be, of course, fossil fuels and other strategic materials. Here's another Harvard hawk, Stephen LeBlanc, an anthropologist at Harvard. He wrote a book called Constant Battles, which combines the Malthusian and Darwinian theories. And it says, war is the inevitable consequence of our ecological demographic propensities. This Malthusian theory, view of resource competition leading inevitably to violence, has become very popular among some green activists. For example, Bill McKibben has written about this, and I'm sure all of you have seen many articles about how global warming is going to lead to wars over water, or over food possibly, because you get droughts leading to scarcity of food, crop failures, and so forth. This has become a big part of the apocalyptic scenarios that many Greens are presenting us with. What scares me is that the Greens are citing some of the same rhetoric that is used by the Pentagon to scare the hell out of politicians and keep their defense budget high. The Pentagon also is saying that there are going to be resource wars in the future as a result of climate change. Counter-evidence. There's a massive study done by a couple of anthropologists at Yale who used to oversee a gigantic cross-cultural database that tried to find correlates between war and various factors in a wide variety of different kinds of societies. And they found a very weak correlation between scarcity, or what could be defined as resource competition, and warfare. And there are certain societies that actually show the opposite correlation. So I already talked about Napoleon Chagnon and the Yanomamo. Chagnon found a reverse correlation between resource scarcity and war. In other words, the Yanomamo tended to fight more when they were really well fed and feeling sort of full of themselves. It's as though then they had the energy to engage in war as a kind of sport. And I think you can find evidence for this in history. So beginning in the early 19th century, you got an enormous increase in standards of living, starting in Europe and then spreading around the world as a result of all the things that happened in the Industrial Revolution. You got, depending on how you count it, almost a tenfold increase in standards of living around the world, and over a period of 200 years or so. And yet we didn't exactly see the end of war in a response to that. And in fact, World War I was fought not by societies that feared scarcity, but by the richest, most prosperous, powerful societies on earth. So it just conflicts with the Malthusian theory. There's a fascinating, for those of you, I know there's some, at least I've been told there's some war and peace scholars here. And I just want to alert you, in case you don't know about it, to a really fascinating, eccentric, but brilliant book called The Statistics of Deadly Quarrels by a Quaker, British Quaker physicist named Lewis Fry Richardson, who became obsessed with war. He was initially trained in applying physics to predicting weather, meteorology. And then he was worried that his research was going to be used by the British to calculate the path of plumes of chemical gas being used in World War I. So he pulled away from the British war research establishment and engaged in this project to try to understand war. And he did this mathematical analysis of hundreds of conflicts over the last 200 years, including right up to World War II, and tried to find out what were the common factors. And he looked at population density, scarcity, inequality, and he couldn't find a strong correlation for any of these factors that are associated either with the Malthusian theory of war or with the very popular Marxist theory of war, which says that it's not resource scarcity per se, it's inequality and class divisions that drives war. Just there isn't good evidence for that. All right, so what does explain war? The evidence is, you can find, I've read many of them, so I know you can find books making a case for practically any theory that you can imagine, any theory of war, because there have been so many wars that you can cherry pick and find evidence for the Darwinian theory or the Malthusian theory, resource competition, Marxist inequality theories of war. When you really look at the breadth of war, of lethal group conflict through human history, what you realize is that there is no type of society that's immune to war, to this kind of conflict. It's afflicted every kind of society, big, small, rich, poor, egalitarian, very authoritarian, hierarchical, societies that are very patriarchal, others that have better gender equality. So what is it? What explains the pattern? The best theory I've found is one that was promoted by Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist. Even to call Margaret Mead the great anthropologist is very controversial these days, in large part, because of the great biodeterminism of modern science. Margaret Mead, who emphasized the importance of culture and of nurture over nature, is not popular. And there have been attempts to accuse her of being a hoaxer, somebody who, somebody who just projected her progressive views onto the societies that she studied. I've read a lot of Margaret Mead over the last 10 years or so. She stands up wonderfully to scrutiny. And we have a lot to learn from her about many things. And she's just a wonderful antidote to all the determinism of modern sciences. But I just wanted to tell you about this little essay, very powerful, that she wrote. Came out in 1940 of all time. Warfare is only an invention, not a biological necessity. So in this essay, you can find it online. It really is worth reading. She points out that there are some societies not only don't wage war, have not been observed waging war by anthropologists. When the anthropologists ask them, have you ever waged war, these people are puzzled. They don't know what the anthropologist is talking about. All people in one village going and trying to kill the people? Why would anybody do that? It doesn't make any sense. These are small tribal societies like the Inuit, for example, and another society she cited that lived in the Himalayas. And then Mead also said that, meanwhile, there's some other extremely simple societies. She cited some Australian Aborigines that seem to fight for no apparent reason. They don't seem to be fighting over land or water, resources. They just fight as a kind of, almost as a kind of game. So Mead looks at Darwinian theory. That's what she's referring to when she says biological necessity. She looks at the resource competition, Malthusian theory. She looks at theories of inequality and class structure. That's what I call the Marxist theories. And she basically presents the idea that war is, rather than being biological, something that evolved in us, war is an invention, a cultural innovation, very much like other very common cultural innovations, monarchy, religion, slavery, capitalism, marriage, trial by jury. So Mead didn't use the term meme, which is kind of like a self-replicating cultural innovation. It was a term coined by Richard Dawkins, but I think if it had been available, she would have used that. It's a good, it matches what she's talking about when she says that war is an invention. The basic idea, another way to put it, is that war war begets war. So how did war originate in the first place? There could be many reasons why war emerges in a society or in a region. It can be, so Napoleon Chagnon said a lot of the fights among the Yanomamo started with two men fighting over a woman. One guy catches another guy having sex with his wife, or thinks that he's having sex with his wife, and he kills him, or bashes his head with a big stick. Then their brothers and cousins get involved, and before long it turns into a big feud that then can last for a really long time. Nobody remembers how it started in the first place. Maybe you have a sociopathic leader, somebody who's charismatic, and just sort of has a light bulb go off and says, wouldn't it be cool if my tribe went over and beat the hell out of those people over there and took all their stuff? And he convinces his friends that that's a good idea. And then they start doing it. Maybe it is over game, hunting areas, water holes, whatever. Once war breaks out in a region, Margaret Mead argued, it then tends to perpetuate itself. And there's a book that made this case, actually this is almost 50 years ago, called Parable of the Tribes, by a really interesting anthropologist named Andrew Schmuckler. And he just has this sort of central scenario that helped me understand how war would spread once it originated in an area. So imagine a region, 10 tribes, 10 societies, they're living in harmony with each other. Then one tribe, they get, let's say, the charismatic sociopath who just wants to start fighting. And that tribe starts attacking all the others. What do those other societies do? They can either run away, or they can surrender, or they can fight back. And you can see in that scenario why war is so insidious. It spreads, it's an invention that spreads to other societies even if they don't want it. And I think this explains a lot of human history. Going back to the biological theories of war, I have a phrase in my book where I say, we don't kill because we're wolves. That would be the biological theory. And of course, it's males. But the Darwinian theory is all about the demonic males having the instinct for war. And we're these vicious predators. It's not that. It's conformity. It's wanting to go along with your cultural values that creates, let's say, a Nazi Germany. And I think that the research of some of the classical social psychologists like Stanley Milgram really helps us to understand how that works. Deference to authority as something that leads to the worst possible atrocities. All right, so implications of this view of warfare. I think there's some really positive implications. One of the things that prevents people from believing that war can end is that they tend to think of it as something that you only get when everything else is perfect as well. You need to create a paradise before war can end. Lions lying down with lambs and that kind of thing. You at least need to have a radical restructuring of society. So there have been a lot of schemes of this kind. You have to get rid of all poverty. You have to get rid of all inequality. You have to get rid of capitalism, which of course leads to inequality. It's nation states that cause war. We have to get rid of them. We have to have a global government. That was a very popular idea after World War I. with Einstein and Bertrand Russell and people like that. Religion causes war. We have to get rid of religion. It's, patriarchal values, that causes war. So there can be no gender inequality. And then maybe we'll have war. Racism. So people are implying that you have to really perfect society before we get rid of war. But my understanding of war as a cultural innovation that then sort of perpetuates itself independent of other factors suggests that if you want to get rid of war, you focus on getting rid of war. You don't focus on getting rid of some other huge thing first. So I actually spend a lot of time talking, not with much success, to social activists, trying to get them to see war as a keystone issue, as something that, if it can be solved, it actually can promote all these other social goods. Justice and more freedom and democracy and less sexism. I really believe that, and in a way that is actually much more likely to happen. On the other hand, remember, Margaret Mead wrote that essay in 1940. Imagine she's trying to write an optimistic essay at that time in human history, and she had reason to be pessimistic. And there's a strain of kind of grim realism in this essay. So she says, once an invention is known and accepted, men do not easily relinquish it. And that is certainly true. But I like to just point out that the world and history are filled with demonstration proofs that humans can live peacefully, and formerly warlike societies can become very peaceful very rapidly, which to me just makes the biological theories of warfare look silly. And by the way, when Adrian Rain is here talking about the biology of crime, ask him about how his genetic, biological, whatever he's working with now, can explain the tremendous variation in crime rates, both in the same society across time or as you go around the world. Biology has nothing to do with that. Anyway, some examples. Two obvious ones are the Germans and the Japanese, two of the most vicious regimes in history, which are now two of the most peaceful nations on earth. Of course, I know you're thinking, well, that's because, they lost, and they were forced to become peaceful, and that's true. Although my sense is not that the Japanese and Germans are repressing all their violent urges to conquer the world again. They have made a cultural shift very rapidly. But I'll give you two other examples of society that did make the shift voluntarily. The Swedes and the Swiss, if you go back to the 18th century and before, were actually quite warlike. And the Swedes in particular were the terror of Northern Europe, were very warlike people, and of course they were the descendants of the Vikings. And both of them, about 2 centuries ago, had just had enough of war and decided to do their best to stay out of the conflicts raging around them in Europe, and they've succeeded very well. One of my favorite examples of a society that's renounced war is Costa Rica. So you all probably know that Costa Rica went through a terrible civil war in the 1940s, and it came out of the war in which a corrupt old regime had used the Costa Rican army to try to suppress a democratic uprising in a really brutal way, and they lost, fortunately. And then the new government came in and said, you know what? This army just seems to, it's supposed to protect us from outsiders, but the army just tends to be used to hurt Costa Ricans. Let's get rid of it. So they dismantled their armed forces. They still have police, of course, but they don't have a standing army. And all those resources that go into sustaining a military have been invested in healthcare and transportation and education. And as a result, there are scholars who try to assess the well-being, the happiness, if you will, of societies with various measures. Costa Rica is always at the top or very close to the top. And of course, the fact that it got rid of its military is central to that, to its well-being. There's a fascinating set of data that I'm sure you've heard about being propagated by various scholars. I first heard about it from a guy named John Mueller, a political scientist at Ohio State. Steven Pinker, I mentioned before, this was a major theme of his book, Better Angels of Our Nature, that if you look at annual war casualties over the last 100 years or so, there has been an extraordinary decline from the first half of the 20th century, which was just blood-drenched, through the second half, which was still pretty bad. Believe it or not, up to the present, except for the recent uptick, especially in Syria. But annual casualties from war, as bad as they are today, if you average them out over, let's say, the last 15 years, are about 2 orders of magnitude less than they were in the beginning of the 20th century, the period of 2 world wars. This has gotten a lot of people very excited. And of course, searching for explanations, there have been many. One, which I kind of like, this is what Steven Pinker argues, that we're seeing the illogic of war and the cost of war more than we ever did. And after 2 world wars, I guess humans are smart enough to learn their lessons sooner or later. And so there's just a growing distaste for war. Globalization, more interdependence of nations, a really fascinating theory coming from political science that you may have heard of called the democratic peace phenomenon. The idea is that democracies, of course, fight non-democracies, but they rarely, if ever, fight each other. This is an idea that Immanuel Kant first proposed more than, he predicted this more than 2 centuries ago. And democracy is increasing. Depending on how you define democracy, about 2/3 of the global population lives in some kind of democratic regime now. You go back more than 100 years and it was maybe 10%. And of course, remember that women didn't have the vote about 100 years ago in any major societies. Here's just, there are all sorts of ways you can define war, and counting war casualties is extremely difficult. This is a graph that was reproduced by Steve Pinker, just to give you a sense of the scale of the decline of war. All right, but then let's get real. We still have some problems. Lots of weapons, from small arms to major weapons systems out there in the world. There are still some horrible conflicts. What's happening now in Syria and Iraq is really frightening. There's some movements that seem to be fomenting more violence, certain strains of religious fundamentalism. One of the ironies of the democratic peace phenomenon is that the desire for freedom and democracy often leads to violence. And remember, the troubles in Syria really began as part of the Arab Spring phenomenon, with people in Syria wanting the same kinds of rights that others were getting in Tunisia and Egypt. And also, it's just that as part of the culture of war, which we still accept, the way to deal with violence is still seen as violence in many places around the world. And I see the biggest problem as being my country, right here at home. I'm sure you know, the United States, the size of our military is roughly that of all other militaries in the world combined, a little bit less. but it's enormous. We are the biggest manufacturer of weapons in the world. We're the biggest seller of weapons around the world. We are the biggest innovator in weapons, far and away ahead of anybody else. And you can see that with drones. I wrote an article on drones a couple of years ago for National Geographic, and it really scared the hell out of me. First of all, drones are coming to the United States. All the law enforcement agencies want drones because they've seen how effective they can be for surveillance. I don't know when drones will be armed in this country, but there are people already thinking about that. But what's more worrisome to me is the international arms race in drones, which is a direct reaction to our demonstration of how great these weapons are, that you can kill people remotely. They're being combined with very sophisticated software that can recognize faces, license plates for targeted assassinations. And there are security people who are really freaked out about how that might affect global security. I write a lot about brain chips just because I think it's a cool technology. The biggest sponsor of neuroscience now, and especially of research on interfaces between brains and electronic devices, is the Pentagon. So some of you may have heard about the big new brain initiative started by Obama. Most of that money comes from the Pentagon, from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, not civilian agencies. We are engaged in a $1 trillion upgrade of our nuclear arsenal right now. Obama received that Nobel Peace Prize in part because he had pledged to begin steps to eradicate nuclear weapons. And he's just not doing that. Or he wouldn't be engaged in this big upgrade. One of the worst problems I have, and then of course the wars that we've been engaged in since 9/11, and one of the worst outcomes of our use of violence is that it legitimizes, we're a role model. When we use violence, we're modeling it for others and we're making it legitimate for others. And we lose all our moral credibility. I don't know how Obama, with a straight face, can give Putin a hard time for pushing people around in the Ukraine, sending troops in, tanks and so forth, given what we're doing around the world. We've lost our moral authority. I think it's an amazing opportunity right now for our country, because we're so strong and because we're so much of the problem, to become the solution. So here's my wish list. I'd love to see politicians in this country just state, we were for world peace, but in a way, back it up with policies to make it credible. Start making some meaningful cuts in the budget. We've got more than 100 military bases overseas, a vast military empire. Let's start pulling that back. Let's have a moratorium on weapons R&D. By the way, I work at this engineering school, which is heavily dependent on defense contracts. So it's made for some awkward conversations. What's great about it is that I was actually invited to give a talk to a bunch of people who are accepting defense money, and then they brought in a bunch of their defense contractor friends from Lockheed Martin and places like that. And I told them, I think what you're doing is bad, and you should stop it, and we should have a moratorium. And there's no threat of that happening, so they just found it kind of entertaining that I would say this. An honest approach to to getting rid of nuclear weapons, I'd like to see. Maybe Obama can somehow do that before he leaves office. Really giving more support to UN peacekeeping measures, and also promoting alternatives to violence around the world, especially nonviolent activism. And by the way, you've got somebody coming next spring, I think it is, Erica Chenoweth, who is a really important scholar because she's done research just demonstrating how, apart from the moral issues, nonviolent activism to overcome repressive regimes, and Egypt is a wonderful example of this, are just more effective. They achieve their objectives in a more, they're more practical. There's a scholar I interviewed for my book named Gene Sharp, who is one of the inspirations of Chenoweth and other nonviolent activists. He, in turn, was inspired by Martin Luther King and Gandhi. There's so much potential there and some of these alternatives to violence. We need an overhaul of just war theory. I've thought a lot about just war theory over the last 10 years. Meaning, I'm not a total pacifist. I think there's some times when actually it's less moral to stay out of a fight. I do believe there's such a thing as humanitarian intervention, where maybe a small bit of force might make a really horrible situation better and avert greater violence. But when and how? That is the question for our age. And, what do we do about ISIS? Just a horrible problem. We don't want to make it worse. So what should we do? And the rule that I've come up with, I call the end of war rule. It just means that whatever you do, it should be consistent with your larger goal of ending war once and for all. And so this is just a list of some things that I think are consistent with that. And they obviously, if they had been followed, the U.S. Position in the world would be very different than it is today. We wouldn't be in Afghanistan or Iraq. We wouldn't be bombing ISIS right now. We would be doing much more to make sure that civilians are not hurt in our attacks. Again, I'm just pie in the sky, and I've been preaching this to some activists I know too. I feel as though an imaginative group or leader can make war, ending war, the great issue of our age. And I actually believe that it can happen really quickly. Because I feel as though there is a yearning for it. There's enormous pessimism, but I think with courage and imagination, our leaders can help us see that it's the time to try to do this. And I think that this idea could potentially appeal to lots of people beyond the traditional anti-war movement, which is really in disarray. It's in sorry shape right now. So as I said, conservatives, get religious people to actually recognize that war is a violation of their sacred scriptures. War is also, not always, for some people war is great for business. But I think most businesses would actually prefer a peaceful world because they'll make more money. War is very disruptive, destabilizing of commerce. As a contrast to Obama's very pessimistic speech, I give my students this speech by JFK shortly before he was assassinated, where he helps us realize that war isn't like a force of nature, an act of God. It's not something that happens to us. It's something that we do, especially in a democracy. We're responsible for our wars. They're not imposed on us. They're not happening to us. We make them happen. And we have to recognize that and make them not happen. And I love that JFK expressed that so eloquently. And again, just as pessimism can be self-fulfilling, so can optimism. And so I think it's essential for people to believe that ending war is possible. Otherwise, it won't happen. And I'm going to end with this image. I've never ended my talk before, but this is something that's been tearing me up lately, and I've been writing about it quite a bit. So these are pictures of children hurt by us, by Americans. On the bottom, just going over my notes, that's there was in 2013 there was an airstrike in Afghanistan. It killed 10 children. That's some of the children there on the bottom. By the way, these are all confirmed by human rights groups, reported in places like the New York Times. The top left, that's a 5-year-old girl who was killed last fall, and she's with her father in Syria by a U.S. strike against ISIS. The Pentagon just formally acknowledged that last spring and said that they felt bad about it. On the top right, some of you might guess, that is a shot from, that's a victim of the hospital run by Doctors Without Borders that was just bombed by the U.S. Last week, I guess it was. 12 patients and staff killed, 3 children, 37 people wounded. Obama felt bad about that. He apologized. Here's the thing. We have killed, it's very difficult to get these kind of data, and for obvious reasons, the Pentagon, if it's keeping track, which it probably isn't, it's not going to publicize these data, but there are reputable human rights groups who say that, for example, Iraq from 2003 to 2011, we killed a minimum of 15,000 civilians, including 1,200 children. And our attacks, our airstrikes against ISIS, which started a year ago in August, we have killed, gives you a sense of the difficulty of getting these kind of data. We have killed between 600 and 1,800 civilians. Unknown number of those are children. I don't understand why we're not talking about this all the time. I am ashamed that my country is doing this. And I hope it's not just a Minnesota thing. You agree with me on? When we apologize, it makes me even more angry, because it's such a hollow gesture. If we actually cared, we wouldn't continue doing it. So ISIS is bad. Those are terrible people. They're killing children too. So the question is, how do we respond to the horrible things happening there without making it worse? And again, I think it's a solvable problem. I think our entire national security apparatus should be trying to solve this problem. And we spend $1 trillion+ on it. For that, I think we should get some answers. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Now, questions for anyone, just come up to the microphone, and it looks like we have a couple, so you're back in business.
Okay.
Hi. I completely agree with you as war as a social construct that we need to eliminate because it's harmful and painful to every human being on Earth. But I think it's a little irresponsible to say that something like sexism doesn't need to be eradicated to create a world where war doesn't exist, because arguably since the beginning of the agricultural society, men and the male gender has been in charge of society, and those are the societies that have perpetuated war.
That's true.
So I think it's questionable to say that sexism is something that cannot have to be solved in order to achieve world peace.
I guess my skepticism comes from looking at the effects of equal rights for women, and especially the right to vote, on patterns of warfare. They have not, that women getting the vote did not, I don't think, substantially change the frequency of war. We still had World War II break out. There have been some very belligerent female leaders. Of course, they're coming out of a often sexist, patriarchal society, so somebody like Hillary Clinton has to be more hawkish than Barack Obama, I think, to have a chance of getting elected. I get that. The point, I need to be clear on this. We need to be working on all those problems independently. I just don't want people to think that we need to solve those problems before we get to the end of war, or to think that if we do solve the problem, if we suddenly Hillary is elected, we really have much greater gender equality, that's going to get rid of militarism in this country. I see no evidence that it will work that way.
But as long as rape is still a weapon of war, can you really say that there's any gender equity in the people who are in charge of dictating it? Yes,
this is the thing. I think getting rid of war will help eliminate some of those horrible abuses. The same is true of some of the other problems I mentioned, inequality. I think war doesn't necessarily create all these other problems, but it exacerbates them. But good question.
All right, thank you.
That was a good question. My question for you is, how can students practice anti-violence on campus or even in their communities?
Oh, let's see. I don't know. Is there a problem with violence on, I'm getting such a, I don't want to overdo this, but I'm getting a really, is there a problem with violence on this campus?
Just like in general for big campus.
I don't know. I'm really worried about the problem of, I went to Columbia, and Columbia has had all these horrible rape scandals that are ripping apart the community. That is bizarre to me. I'm not sure where that came from. I thought that kind of behavior was really a thing of the past. In terms of nonviolence just in relations between people on campus, I haven't given that a lot of thought. If any of you have ideas to give me, pardon me? So teaching methods of nonviolent conflict resolution and so forth.
No, the violence.
Oh, it does exist here. Okay. I guess it exists everywhere now. Maybe it's related to the culture of drinking. I don't know. I'm sorry. That's outside of my boundaries. Any other? Oh, yeah.
We're all on this side.
Oh, okay.
Currently, I'm taking a class called Arab Spring to ISIS, and we're kind of studying the process of the Arab Spring and how it has developed into ISIS. And we're looking at what the United States has done and what it hasn't done. And so I was hoping to get your perspective on what the United States should have done differently with the Arab Spring conflict.
All right, so the big problem was, I thought Egypt, I know Egypt continues to have problems, but I thought it made me so hopeful. And then it was so depressing to see what happened, especially in Syria. And the mistake that we made was starting to arm people in there to try to pick winners and give them military training and weapons. I think the last thing that area needs is just more weapons and more people who know how to use them. The alternatives at this point are looking a little weak, to be honest. But it seems to me the first step toward addressing that problem there should be recognizing that we created it in part with our invasion of Iraq and by injecting extreme violence into an already violent area.
Right.
But it is a daunting problem.
It is. One more question for you. So what is your perspective on neoliberalism in that regard of government in trying to like impose our democratic society / neoliberalism on those countries?
Neoliberal, oh, so you mean the conservative hope that we could impose democracy on countries like Iraq?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Well, again, this is here's one of the paradoxes of the democratic peace phenomenon that I cited before. It was mentioned by Paul Wolfowitz, among others, one of the intellectuals in the Bush White House, as a justification for the invasion of Iraq. We were going to create democracy there, and then it would spread to these other regions. Listen, it might have worked out that way. It's possible. But given that there was really no history of democracy in that region, a lot of people thought that it wouldn't work. And of course, it's turned out that it didn't. To me, the lesson would be that you don't impose democracy by force.
Right.
That's just not going to be a good idea, at least at this point in human history.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay.
Okay, my question was, I know you talked a lot about foreign policies and how we're sort of perpetuating violence overseas, but what would you say about the culture here in the States? I mean, it's clear that we've had some, individuals that have gone on killing sprees, and is there a way that we can get out of the cycle of violence that is happening here?
Okay, I do think it's important to point out our successes. So violence in this country is way down over the last 25 years. It's fantastic. So I'm right across the Hudson River from New York. I lived in New York in the late 80s when it was actually a scary place. The rate of violent crime, homicide, and so forth was extremely high, and nobody really knows why it has become so low lately. It might be that just as violence kind of is infectious and spreads, and we're talking now about more criminal violence and homicides and so forth, so is its absence. So that's a good thing. But in terms of, if you're asking a question about the culture or what might lead to these mass shootings, I've looked at the literature of violent media games and or violent video games and movies and television shows and all that, and trying to link that to violent acts, and the correlation is actually really weak. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I'm sickened that American Sniper made like $500 million. Mm-hmm. It was an extraordinarily popular movie, and I can't believe that a movie like that has no effect. That movie, if you remember, started off showing the hero killing a child and a woman and his mother. They deserved it because they were trying to hurt American soldiers, but I see that as Clint Eastwood's bizarre attempt to justify that. And I think that Americans actually, I hope, on some level, are appalled by some of the things that are happening in our name around the world, some of the acts that we're perpetrating, and that's why they go to a movie like that. Yeah. So there are some good trends in culture, and then some really disturbing ones. And the mass shootings, of course, are always horrible. I don't think, if we're talking about sort of things that need to be done before we get rid of war, I don't see us getting rid of the gun culture. I think it'll be easier to end war than it will be to end the gun culture in this country. That's why I don't want to wait for us to change, for war to end.
I guess then, would you think that it's not necessarily that we're more violent, but that it's the media we're hearing more about it? Or does it have to do with the media?
As I said, I don't know.
Yeah.
And you know, there's plenty of, there are anti-war films out there too. And I hear that there are anti-war video games. I'm not sure. I mean, my son loved first-person shooter games. And then he got into something called airsoft. So he would dress in military fatigues. He had a gun that looked just like the combat rifles that they use in Iraq and Afghanistan. And he'd go out and with all these other guys dressed the same way, and they'd shoot each other with BBs that can break your tooth off. But he's a great kid. He's totally non-violent, at least so far. So I don't, we're grasping at straws. This is what worries me. And this worries me a lot more, actually, than the mass shootings, as horrifying as they are.
So you're saying they're sort of different entities.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
This is...
No, I mean, yeah, I agree. I'm just trying to clarify it. That
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, I'm sorry if I...
No, that's fine.
Confused you even more.
My question is, how can we educate the younger generations on violence prevention in an effective way without sugarcoating the facts?
How can we educate the next generation?
Yeah.
Without sugarcoating the facts? Well, I'm trying my best. Part of it comes from, here, going back to the media games, so the scholars talk a lot about desensitization. You've seen, 100,000 people killed in your games and movies and so forth, and maybe that has some kind of impact, but I'm not a First Amendment absolutist. Let me put it this way. Japan loves violent media also, and they have virtually no violent crime there. Mm-hmm. And they also aren't, they're not engaging in acts of war around the world. I think what I try to do with my students is get them to have a sense of responsibility and agency for what their countries do and what they do as citizens, and get them to realize that some of these things are happening, that they should care about them, they should feel responsibility for trying to make a difference, rather than being fatalistic. I don't know about students here or what you professors encounter, but the pessimism and fatalism among my students is extraordinary. All of them think that the world is just going to hell, and the attitude of a lot of them is, and I'm just going to try to, get a great job and have some fun before everything ends. And so I try to change their thinking about that, and actually point out that lots of things in the world are going really well, or moving in the right direction.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I don't know if that answered you.
No,
I feel
you
like
did.
I'm not really
Thank you.
answering any of the questions.
I was just wondering where we would be without war at this point, not necessarily just the U.S., but the world in general. And then I have a second question.
Okay, so when people ask that question, you could be asking, well, what if we hadn't fought in World War II? What if we hadn't had the Revolutionary War? I do think that some wars are more just than others. World War II is sort of the gold standard in just war. On the other hand, we never want to do that again.
Right.
World War II, the good guys were monsters in World War II. I wrote this summer, it was the, 70th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and one of my colleagues at my school is one of the world's leading historians of nuclear weapons, and I learned a lot from him. He talked about picking the target. The people in the Pentagon and Truman deciding what Japanese cities to bomb, and then, assessing the damage after. They deliberately picked a population center. They considered a demonstration over Tokyo Harbor that the emperor would see to scare the hell out of them. But then they actually were curious to know what the bombs would do when they landed on a densely populated area as a kind of experiment. That was part of the reasoning. So, we killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. So did the British. The good guys did horrible things. So I think we have to talk about war in a way, acknowledge that some wars might have been necessary, but we should all agree that those should never happen again. I guess, right. I don't know.
No,
again,
I understand that. Okay. Yeah, it's kind of a broad question. And then, we talk about how the U.S. military is the largest by far, but, if we were to cut budgets and lower the size of our military, that would also lower the amount of jobs we had. And so, do you think that plays a factor in why we're not lowering our military size, because our unemployment rate would go up and there would be a lot more unemployed?
Yeah, I've looked at some of the, there are lots of economists who look at these sorts of issues, and one of the meanest columns I wrote over the last year was in response to an essay in the New York Times by a very prominent economist who was arguing that war is good for us because it creates jobs and lots of innovation, and just sort of ignore all the dead people that war leads to. And war does some really great things. And I said that was like saying that cancer is really great because it leads to lots of fantastic research and innovation if you can just ignore all the dead people. The studies, but I try to counter with facts and reason as well. The studies I've seen have said that war is actually a really inefficient creator of jobs. You get many more good, high-quality jobs if you invest in education and healthcare, which are things that we really need, than if you invest in, the giant, the military machine.
Okay.
So.
All right. Thank you.
Sure.
Earlier in your lecture, you talked about how, in some instances, if in order to get a peaceful society or a peaceful world, some violence or some force would be necessary in order to push in the right direction. So I was wondering, in your opinion, what instances would justify the use of more violence in order to stop violence?
I have pacifist friends. I've read some interesting arguments about how we could have avoided the worst consequences of World War II by not violently opposing Hitler. I don't find those very credible. One of the classic cases where some people think humanitarian intervention could have averted a horrible calamity is Rwanda. The problem is we just don't know about these things. I'm focused so much on the overuse of violence right now. It's hard for me to imagine where it might be useful. As far as ISIS goes now, I don't believe a lot of what I read about ISIS, except that so many of the really horrible things are coming from human rights groups that I respect and find very credible. It might be, I hate to say this, it might be that some combination of humanitarian intervention to deal with the refugees combined with small force. No, I can't even say that. It's just been too disastrous. This is what I honestly don't understand how people think that more bombs in that region will help, given what's happened in Afghanistan and Iraq. Is there anybody who thinks that those have been successes? And so why would we think that now things will be different when the situation there is exponentially more complex than it was in Afghanistan and Iraq when we used force in those areas? We don't even know who the good guys are. I just read that Obama decided he's not going to arm the Syrian rebels anymore. And I thought, we're still arming Syrian rebels? And because remember, we're also trying to get rid of Assad, supposedly. We don't know what we're doing there. So it just seems that, yeah. Other than that, let me give you an example of a really horrible example where extreme force ended one of the worst conflicts in the modern era. Some of you, it's not widely known that one of the worst, bloodiest civil wars in recent history was in Sri Lanka. Horrible civil war there with really high casualties, atrocities on both sides. The Tamils against the, I think primarily Buddhist majority. And the rebels were finally isolated in one region and then carpet bombed by the government and basically annihilated. I don't know if anybody here knows the details, but so you could say, well, that's one way to end a civil war, is just like kill everybody. You know, large number, they killed the fighters, and they were also with a lot of civilians. They just killed them all. And that war is over. So I guess, again, it's my end of war. It's to try to deal with these problems in a way that makes them less likely to happen in the future. Hard problem, though.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay.
Do you think the biggest problem facing us today in terms of war is religious fundamentalism, especially in the Middle East? You also have things like Sharia law, which is something that was only seen in really radical areas like Saudi Arabia or Afghanistan, but now even more tolerant countries like Indonesia are also introducing efforts to introduce these kind of religious barbaric measures like whipping for sex that's out of wedlock that do you feel will perpetuate violence and perpetuate a culture of violence?
I feel as though so there have been these strains of religious fundamentalism around for a while. Then 9/11 happened, but they were, I think, at a very low level of lethality. Then 9/11 happened, and then we had to decide what to do about it. I think we responded in a way that made that problem much worse. So I have atheist friends who hate religion, and I read the book. I've met Richard Dawkins. I know some of those people who say all our problems come from religion. Well, that's just obviously not true. I think it's ideological extremism, fanaticism in itself, whether it's secular or religious, that leads to bad things happening. That's what we somehow have to avoid. And some of the greatest anti-war leaders in history. I've been reading a lot of Martin Luther King recently, and it's just constantly bowled over by the power of his thinking and how ahead of his time he was in recognizing some of the flaws of his own country and pointing them out at great personal risk, antagonizing even other people on the liberal left. So religion can be an enormous force for progress, too. Again, I want to focus on war itself and try to separate it out from some of these things that do complicate the issue and exacerbate the issue, but in themselves won't solve the issue.
So, I know this is cliche, but if you take ISIS for example, they are causing a huge war. It is largely. Would you say that's largely in part of religious fundamentalism, or just because with everything in general, the conflicts of the last 30 years?
ISIS seems to, as far as I can tell, it's I mean, I've read a lot about it, and we're mainly looking at it from the outside. It's this very apocalyptic ideology. I assume the fact that it's attracting young people, men and women, from prosperous Western cultures, some from the United States, but lots from Europe, says something about, people aren't getting what they need from modern life. It's really, I admit, it's very scary. I'm really worried about what's happening there, and I wish I had better ideas for what to do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Horgan will hang around a while if you want to continue this conversation out in the hallway. We've got a nice buffet, and don't forget to visit the Veterans for Peace table and the Duluth Sister Cities table. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you. I'll just grab this. Okay, this is mine.